Welcome to Taking Care of Business on News Talk 1180 KERN for the best in Saturday Talk Radio at 1 o'clock and on 1230 KGEO at 10 o'clock Saturday, and for the best in Wednesday Talk Radio on 1410 KERI, the Christian station. We're now on 1000 KKIM in Albuquerque, New Mexico, and now we are in the Richmond, Oakland, San Francisco Bay Area. Your host is Clay Koerner, and I'm Marty Pay, and our producer is Greg Held. Clay, do you like that intro music? That's the Tonight Show, which is kind of a lead into our first guest. But before we introduce our first guest, I just wanted to thank our guest last week. We had a dynamite show with theologian and author Michael Novak, talking about his new book, Writing from Left to Right. And then our second guest was an old friend of the show, Michael Reagan. We had a great conversation with him about Alzheimer's. And in the second part of the show, we talked about child abuse, which he suffered as a child from a camp counselor. But on a happier note, today we've got a great show lined up. In the second half, we have Tracy Reynolds from Shannon Grove's office talking about an issue that's close to her heart. But now by phone, we have a gentleman we've had the pleasure of interviewing before, Henry Bushkin, formerly Johnny Carson's attorney, talking about his new book, Johnny Carson. Is this where I go, here's Clay?
Here's Marty.
Henry, welcome back to Taking Care of Business.
Thank you. It's nice to be with you guys.
Henry, I got to tell you, I mentioned this off the air. The book came out on Audible last week, and I've been I just finished the Kennedy detail, and then like half an hour later started this book, and it's really enjoyable. I am really, really loving this book. There's a lot of insight to Johnny Carson for those of us that grew up with Johnny.
Well, I'm delighted to hear that because, look, he was the best, I think, late-night talk show guy ever, host, maybe the best in television ever, and iconic. And he died without a funeral.
What?
He died without a memorial. And there was a PBS special last year that got some good ratings, sort of renewed interest in Johnny. And this book hopefully continues that. Maybe he's entitled to a renaissance. I think I said that when I was on last week or so. He really deserves it. The public deserves to know how complex and complicated he really was.
Well, you were his best friend and attorney for almost 2 decades. And you know, it was I think the best years of his life, certainly of mine, in the sense of what we did and how we did it and sort of the creative energies that were flowing at the time. Everything was working for a good period of time, and it ended after 18 years, much like a divorce after being married for 18 years.
And why did it end?
Because we were in the process of building a pretty good company. We had over 100 people working for us, and Johnny felt that was taking too much of his time and too much of my time away from the Tonight Show. So he wanted to close it down. I resisted. I was let go, and then the next lawyer following me, Ed Hookstratton, did shut it down. So that's what happened. He shut a thriving business down, which is really counterintuitive to any standard business practice. And that's what ended our relationship.
And what kind of business was that?
Well, we owned the Tonight Show, and we had multiple shows in production, and we had multiple things going on, and a thriving production company.
Well, that's a pretty good segue here, because you pretty much ended the way you started, because according to the book, I do some financial planning, and looking at it, his finances were in a shamble. He had people taking advantage of him.
They were just awful at the time, and fortunately that situation corrected itself, and he died worth maybe $500 million.
Wow. Well, in the late 70s, when you took over, if I remember right, I made a note here that you had said he was making $3,000 a week is all he was making, and the rest of it was in deferred comp, which
that was in the late
silly.
60s, not the late 70s. In the late 70s, he was making $25 million a year.
Okay.
So things had changed.
Now, I guess Philip Morris, his ad agency, was making more than $3,000, or they wanted more than $3,000 a week, which is what he was making.
William Morris
yeah.
was commissioning $100,000 a week when he was taking home $3,000 a week. So there was a little discrepancy. They wanted more money from him than he was actually earning.
Wow.
And that was the end of William Morris. That's what ended their relationship.
Well, he had, I think, the best delivery of any comedian. The closest one to him would be the one that's on the Tonight Show now, I think.
Oh, you
mean... Jay Leno,
yeah.
Sure, David Letterman, of course, but I don't believe any subsequent late-night talk show host could match Johnny's brilliance. I think if you put them all together, I don't think they match his brilliance.
How long was he on the show?
30 years.
Wow. With no breaks? They never fired him like they fired Leno?
No, he just about fired the network. They didn't fire him. It was quite the opposite. He gained ownership of The Tonight Show as a result of a piece of litigation that we had in 1980. So rather than them owning the show, which they did, now Johnny owned the show.
So who owns it now?
Well, after Carson left, it reverted back to NBC. They always owned the name The Tonight Show. That was always theirs. So after him, they owned it. Before him, they owned it. During his period, he owned it.
That makes sense. Our guest by phone is Henry Bushkin, Johnny Carson's attorney, talking about his new book, Johnny Carson.
You know, Henry, I've always wondered where all the money comes from to pay these celebrities and to manage the show. Maybe you can give us a little insight.
Well, for years, Johnny's show was profitable to NBC to the extent that the profits from the Tonight Show were carrying the entire network, which was losing money. So the Tonight Show, in its heyday, was making $50 million a year for NBC.
Well, where's the money come from?
From sponsors.
Ah, just sponsors.
Advertising. You know, commercials. I mean,
that's where it all comes from.
That's where it comes from, commercials.
Wow.
Yeah. You also, he was getting shafted on the clothing line when you took over, if I remember right. He didn't have any ownership in it? He wasn't making any money?
At the time, there was Johnny Carson Apparel, of which he owned none of it. And his manager owned 50%, and the clothing, Hart, Schaffner & Marx owned 50%. And so shortly after I took over, that was changed. Johnny got the 50%, and the Hart, Schaffner & Marx retained 50%. And the company was doing about $100 million in sales a year when Johnny shut that down.
And you got, if I remember right, you got him $400,000 a year right out of the chute from the clothing company.
That was his pay for, let's say, modeling. I mean, that's what he got paid for posing for the still ads. But he always wore the clothes on the show, albeit they were always custom made. They weren't off the production line. So he always was the most elegantly dressed guy at any affair because everything he made was everything he wore was custom made.
You know, there was one time I saw a clip where they were in Vegas. It was Dean Martin, Johnny, and a couple
Sammy Davis and Johnny.
Yeah, that was really an interesting show where he stood up and sang at that show. Yeah,
well, that was in St. Louis. That was at the Kiel Opera House, and that was a benefit for a guy named the Hoodlum Priest, and it was for the Ditmas Foundation, and Johnny was called in to substitute for Joey Bishop that night, and he wound up singing with Sinatra and Dean Martin and Sammy Davis. It's a great YouTube video, by the way.
Yeah, I've seen it a couple of times. I thought it was in Vegas, though. Did he do a lot of donating of his time and efforts to help raise money for different causes?
Oh, sure. He was the most generous in that regard. He probably helped raise more money in Hollywood during his day than anybody, because whenever he would host an affair, it was always going to be a sellout. So, yeah, he was well sought after, and he was liberal with his time for charitable causes.
I believe he was a big fan of Bakersfield, too, wasn't he?
Well, he talked about it a lot.
Yeah, I know.
Bakersfield and Burbank.
I'm not sure what sort of fan he was, but I know he talked about it.
Bakersfield and Burbank, huh?
And Oxnard.
And Oxnard, there you go, and also
Right.
Oxnard, yeah. He wasn't really the first pick to replace Jack Parr, was he? He was like the third or fourth?
Well, Steve Allen started it, and Johnny took over for Jack Parr. So Johnny would have been the third, and arguably for 30 years the best there ever was.
Well, no, I mean, but when they picked Johnny Carson, he wasn't the first pick for that position. It was like,
that was before my time, but I think historically that's correct.
Yeah,
I think he was not an obvious choice at all, and it may have been his by default. I don't really know exactly.
Yeah, I think actually I read this in your book, but it was Joey Bishop was the first pick, and then there was two or three.
Look, at the time I wrote it, I would have researched that, but I do know that it was a lot of different things that combined to get him the job. Luck being a great part of it.
Definitely. When we come back to the break, let's talk a little bit about Johnny Carson, the man. We'll be back in a moment on Taking Care of Business.
Did I put you on hold for 1 second?
Sure. Taking Care of Business. We'll be back in a moment on Taking Care of Business on Koerner Radio, News Talk 1180.